Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin in 3 minutes. Please welcome Hodinkee founder Ben Clymer and Aurel Bacs.
All right. Good morning, everybody. We really appreciate you guys coming out here at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I'm not sure who scheduled this. I think it was probably me, honestly. But a little bit early on the weekend, so we are sincerely appreciative. So today we have a longtime friend of mine and obviously, you know, real maven and kind of tastemaker and influential person, certainly in the watch world, Mr. Aurel Bacs. Aurel, I met first when he was at Christie's so many years ago, and now obviously is the head, really, or I guess really in collaboration with the Philips watch department. And obviously he is the man that has sold nothing short of the Paul Newman. He was the purchaser of the super complication, the Henry Graves, which is actually the most expensive watch in history, I believe. And so today we wanted to talk about things that are a little bit out of the you know, Aurel is never afraid to deal with things head on, frankly, you know, and the auction world often is kind of mired with controversy. There are wild accusations at times about what auction houses can be to the watch community, and not only watch community, but art community, et cetera. And so Aurel has been gracious enough to answer those questions kind of head on. And so again, just like with yesterday, we will leave plenty of time for you guys to answer, or I'm sorry, to ask questions to Aurel at the end of the session. So first things first, who bought the Paul Newman?
I had a feeling that was coming, but let me first say, congratulations, Hodinkee. I think it's amazing what you guys did in the last 10 years. And you do a huge service to the community, bringing transparent information to the world. What was the question? Well, I guess you know my answer. All I can say, it was not a corporation.
It was not.
It was not a Russian drug lord. It was not a Mexican narco dealer.
Yeah.
It was really an incredibly passionate, wonderful person. I didn't say man or woman, who's possibly watching right now with the watch on the wrist.
So this person was, and we won't spend too much time on this, but this person was part of the watch community. It wasn't some billionaire. It wasn't somebody that had never bought from you before or anything like that.
That person has already purchased other watches from us before.
So a real enthusiast then has the Paul Newman. There you go. You have it. You heard it here first.
Maybe not in the room? No.
So, you know, the auction world has changed so much, even over the course of my career, which is admittedly much shorter than yours. What has been the driving force between, A, the rise in prices at auction, and then also the rise in controversy at auction? You know, I think 10 years ago, there's a few people here, John Goldberger, for example, Davide Parmigiani, who have been here from the early days, but so many of us really came around in the last 5 or 6 years. How have things changed for you?
It's been an amazing 10 years, the last 10 years. Why the rising prices? I think back to the 90s when I stood for the first time on a rostrum. At most, we had 50 people in the room. At most, 20 telephone bidders, 10 absentee bidders. That's it. So that means a good auction had 100 bidders. Today, looking back to this fall season, we have between 200 and 400 people in the room, and that's the minority in terms of the group. We have over 300 telephone bidders, over 600 online bidders, and then we have another type of bidders, the advanced bidders. Those can submit bids. So we have about 1,500. The volume of the auctions has come down. I remember once I had 550 watches in an auction catalog.
At Christie's?
Yeah. And today we're looking at max 200 if we're lucky. And I say lucky because we're really struggling to find the quality watches that we would like to offer. So that means we have probably about 6 to 8 times more bidders than watches. So that means we have a shortage in property or not enough supply for the demand. Right. The community has grown exponentially, right, whereas the pool of good watches hasn't grown. In fact, it has probably even become less. So that is one explanation why rising prices. What has changed? Of course, the internet has changed our industry radically. Many good things have come. The community can now share information so much easier than we heard it from Matt yesterday, that there was just no information available. It was trial and error. Yes, you could go to pawnbrokers and find Paul Newmans. But today we have so much information, I feel sometimes too much information. We have scholars that I've never even heard of. They are going by Happy Girl 111 on Instagram. And they say, this guy from the auction house should go to jail, and the bezel on that Hoyer is a fake. Like, wow, where's that coming from? Yeah. Whereas all the Hoyer, the senior community is embracing the watch. So I think we have, everything goes much faster, everything is much more intense, it's more competitive. I think as long as a great watch was $1,000, there was no need to be jealous, to be aggressive, to be even mean at times to your peers. The same watch today is $50,000, and we see sometimes energies that I wished wouldn't be there.
Yeah. You know, something that I've witnessed myself, even about myself and also about you. I mean, I've heard wild rumors about yourself, about Philips. I've heard wild rumors about me, which I promise you are not accurate. And I think sometimes when you see somebody like Philips and like yourself, Aurel, you know, achieve such great success. I mean, selling a steel Daytona for $17 million, et cetera, is not a normal thing. And I think people are curious how stuff like that happens. And you've already answered that, you know, this was not bought by a drug cartel or anything like that. What is it about the watch community that we think, or that you think we could change to kind of change the conversation? I mean, there's nothing, I would imagine that Philips, Christie, Sotheby's is not doing anything illegal, right? I mean, money laundering is something that that is often brought up in the auction world.
When I saw on your website, Aurel is going to talk, amongst other things, about money laundering. I thought we were going to have the IRS in the room. Like, now we learn how the guys are doing it. Yeah. I tell you, if anyone from a drug cartel is listening in, don't go to a watch auction and don't raise your paddle for a $17 million watch. It would be the worst thing you can do. I tell you why. First of all, every bidder who comes to what I would call a serious auction house, you mentioned Sotheby's, Christie's, Philips, you have to give your ID. I don't know if the Escobars of the world want to do that. Second, you have to give a proof of residence. That means a utility bill, electricity, water, really that shows that you live where you say you live. If you use a company, an offshore company, any company, you have to give certificate of incorporation, directorship, shareholder structure. I mean, we have a compliance department that is about as big as this room here. It's impossible and silly to even think that an auction house is good, because A, it's public, right. The serial number is published, the painting is published, the diamond has a GI certificate. It's insane, that these speculations, but they're out there.
And so how do you handle those speculations? When somebody says, well, you know, you guys are in cahoots with so-and-so, and how do you address those things head on?
Thankfully, sometimes these accusations are so ridiculous and silly that they make me laugh. Yeah. Sometimes I must admit, especially when my 12-year-old daughter reads Aurel should go to jail. He sold Paul Newman for 17 million. I mean, my daughter says, Daddy, why does this guy say you go to jail? That hurts. I think it hurts especially friends and family who are drawn into this. Pictures from birthday parties. I mean, you know the same. Sure. On you sometimes feel like poor Ben. But you get used to it. You get used to it. We are, in a way, public figures. What you do, what I do. We cannot do an auction online with thousands of viewers and not people recognize you on the street. Yeah. It is what it is.
Yeah, and I think something else, you know, to move away from this kind of topic a little bit, something else that we saw yesterday on stage with the vintage dealers, with Eric Wind on one side of things, and then Alessandro Ciani on another, and then Matt Bain kind of in the middle. This whole idea of restorations, and so now we're seeing watches that are mint and unrestored, and you know, really from original owners selling for crazy numbers, and watches that have, you know, redone lume plots, for example, becoming effectively worthless. You know, and if we look at the car, there's charm right now. But a restored Miura would cost roughly the same price. So why don't you think we see that in the watch world?
I think we as a community still have to mature a lot. I think when I see here this crowd here, I think average age is probably somewhere in the 30s at most, I would guess. And I think the watch market as such is still in its adolescence. We've come a long way. We're no longer a baby. We're no longer a kid without any experience. But we're not there where the impressionist market is that has been collected for 100 years. Example, a friend of mine has bought a 1973 Porsche 911 2.4S. He was really proud about it until a super scholar looked at the car and said, do you know any Porsche, not 73 version? So he went to forums, discussion forums, literature, and eventually figured out that it is indeed a 1974 mirror. Possibly back then, the original owner hit a wall, the mirror fell off. He went a year later to Porsche, they fixed it, fine. Yeah. So he went at great effort to source the correct mirror. He went to the Essen Motor Show and spent in a huge hall the whole day digging in those cardboard moving boxes until he found that mirror. Cost him about 1,000 euros. He was really proud, put it on, and the community applauded. Which it should be, I think, appropriately. Now here's an example that I recently lived myself. We had a stainless steel chronograph, I'm not going to mention the maker, in our auction. In my view, the case was really strong. The dial was original, the lume plots were beautiful, sort of similar color like your suede shoes. And we checked the bezel, and it was the correct bezel for the watch. A few weeks before the auction, I get tipped off by a friend, hey, you know, on this blog, they're trashing this watch. And I said, what? What's wrong with it? I go and read, and somebody said, you know, that watch was on eBay a year ago, and the bezel was different. So I go and check it out, and exactly like the Porsche, it had the wrong bezel, and the consignor found at great expense, at great length of effort, the right bezel. And it was not good. So now I'm asking you, we go back to a 50-year-old watch, and at one point in its life, the original bezel was lost or damaged. Is there a difference if The bezel was changed in the 70s Hoyer, in the 80s at a authorized dealer, at the 90s at Matt Bain's workshop, in the noughties found on eBay. It is the correct bezel that Jack Hoyer wanted to be on that watch in 1973. Right. And why can we not applaud when somebody does a good restoration? Someone said yesterday, as long as it's transparent. I agree. I think it's not appropriate if we doctor watches and don't say they're restored. The problem is, if I doctor a watch, I sell it to you, you believe it's real, you sell it to Cara, she believes it's real and she sells it to someone here in the room. Who's the wrong guy? Well, of course, the guy who didn't disclose it. But why attacking now the third person when the bezel is correct? So I think we all, as a community, should, first of all, accept that a vintage watch is vintage. I mean, how can a 75-year-old non-waterproof watch not have a blemish on a scratch in the case, slightly rubbed hallmark? I think we should still go quite a way, because simply there's not enough new old stock original owner watches, right, even for this room.
Right, and so how do you handle that when somebody comes in with a watch that has been restored currently? Because right now the market would say this watch is not really acceptable. I mean, it's not even sellable at a Phillips or a Christie's, something like
that. First of all, if a vintage chronograph has an original bezel that was recently replaced, to me the watch is sellable.
Right.
Because if your Miura has a new rear mirror, but it's the correct one for 1970, whatever it is, yep, what's wrong with it? Right. I think disclosure, transparency is the most important thing. I think auction houses are an extraordinary platform today to buy a vintage watch, because we are under such scrutiny and such pressure from the community. Every flaw is discussed on websites, at get-togethers, that by the time a watch is in the at the exhibition, that means it already made 4 or so weeks with the catalog, and a watch is still there with a condition report, with a description, with a certificate. You're very, very safe buying that watch, yeah, because it went through basically every possible filter the community can offer today.
Right, so what type of vetting does Phillips do before the catalog is published? How many people take a look at this watch?
So that has changed a lot. When we had a $50,000 Patek Philippe in the 1990s, there was one picture, a description that says a gold chronograph, case number, movement number, estimate 20,000. And then every watch already has any conceivable documents and paperwork and research from the archives of the company, those companies who provide that. Now, we have some who are extraordinarily helpful: Vacheron Constantin, Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe. They're fabulous. Omega, I couldn't praise them enough. Some companies either lost them or don't really help, Rolex regrettably, for whatever reason. So that's the first step. That, however, does not yet tell us if the watch is in original condition. It tells us how was it made 50 years ago. We have today a team of about 20 plus specialists around the world. So it's never just one guy, like in a hospital, it's not just one doctor who checks you out, it's his fellow doctor, et cetera, et cetera. We have our watchmaker. He used to be a professor at the Geneva Watchmaking School, coming from a completely different angle, very technical, very analytical, less aesthetic or less historical. And then we have, and this is really sort of my crown jewel, we have an advisory board. The advisory board is composed of a number of senior citizens in our community, notably John Goldberger is here, Jason Singer, Helmut Krott, with decades of experience. They're under no legal obligation or liable for whatever they say, but we always ask them, come a couple of weeks before the catalog goes to press, look at things, and tell us what you think about them. And it has happened that John Goldberger came and said, you know what, Aurel? I can't tell you why, but it just doesn't feel good. I don't think you should put that at auction. Done.
So all it takes is one kind of advisory board member to say no.
You know, I appreciate, one thing I appreciate more than all Googling and the sort of online scholars is the hundreds of thousands of watches that a John Goldberger or an experienced dealer has seen in 30 or 40 years in life. There's nothing that can replace experience. So I bow to those who have really touched and handled and engaged real with the watch in their hand.
Interesting. So what is it about vintage watches that has attracted so much attention when modern watches, 10 years ago, everything was modern. Nobody really cared about vintage, and now vintage has taken on this life of its own, certainly thanks to, in part to what Philips has done, no doubt. What is it about vintage that makes it different than modern watches, as we both sit up here wearing modern watches?
First of all, there's no right or wrong. I'm not a vintage Taliban. No, people sometimes think that I'm not, that I don't see any. On the contrary, I have plenty of contemporary watches. I think it's a wonderful hand in hand. There's no vintage without contemporary and vice versa. Vintage has a dimension that modern cannot offer. And modern can offer things that vintage cannot offer. I think vintage has another dimension, and that is the history, the patina, the uniqueness, because every vintage watch has lived a life that a modern watch has not yet lived. Of course, we've heard it on our panel talk with Wei Ko the other night. This dimension is like, let me put it this way. Imagine you have the choice to go out with Barbie and Catherine Deneuve. Barbie years exactly the same. It's perfect, it's clean, it's crisp, it's immaculate. And then you've got something that has graciously aged with a few wrinkles, a couple of gray hairs maybe, but it has a story to tell. I also believe we realize today that many watches that were perceived as exclusive can be reproduced quite easily. You cannot reproduce a pink gold 1518. And even if you did with a 3D printer in China, super sophisticated, it will never be the same. It never has the soul, the charm, the sensuality, the softness, like than a vintage watch.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about some of your highlights, your most memorable moments in watches. We'll begin with the Henry Graves sale. So you were the purchaser of that watch on behalf of somebody else who I guess will remain.
Thank you, yes. I don't have a $24 million watch at home.
Yes, so.
Thank you. Which, by the way, is funny. The night I bought that watch, I came home and our 12, well, back then she was 8. Livy and I come home and she said, where do you come from? I said, well, we just bought at auction a $24 million watch. And she said, and how are we going to pay for that? So yes, it was an extraordinary emotional roller coaster to me.
And this, just to give some context here, so you had left Christie's. You had announced that you'd be working with Philips? I forget. So you had not yet announced that you'd be working.
Or it was about the same day.
Around the same.
Yeah, you broke the news.
Oh.
I think it was 2 or 3 days after we announced the new Philips project.
So timed masterfully, no doubt. And so your coming out party, I guess, after a year of, a non-compete with Christie's, was coming into the Sotheby's, a competing sale room, and buying the most expensive watch in history.
Yes, there was. It was a collector, very important collector, trusted friend, I shall say, who asked me, what do you think of that watch? And I said, you know what, this is the end game in horology. It's the peak of collaboration between masters from the Vallée de Joux. It was years and years of work. It has an incredible sort of career with the Time Museum, with just from Henry Graves to where it is now. I really think you should think about it. And he was like, I don't know. It's a lot of money. How much is it, 6 or 8 million? He asked me, do you go to the auction because there's a Daytona in there that I'd like you to look at for me? Sure, I go. What I didn't realize is the Daytona was 2 or 3 lots before the Henry Graves super complication. So he says, call me for the Daytona. So we were bidding 65, 70, 75, 80,000. Fair warning, 80,000 sold. Well, okay, here's And then he asked me, when is the big thing coming up? And I thought, he doesn't even know what he's talking about, the big thing. I said, it's in 2 or 3 lots. And he said, are you going to be in the room? I said, yeah, I'm going to be in the room. I can't miss this. Yeah. Okay, do you mind if we're staying on the phone and I listen in? Sure. So he knew already a month or 2 before when it was announced he wanted to watch, but he did not reveal that intention to me. And at one point, the bidding starts, 555, 665. I remember Claude was an early bidder. And at one point he says, bid. What do you mean? Raise your pedal. Like, my pedal? 8 minutes. And we went all the way.
So that's a, first of all.
So total emotional roller coaster. It was obviously a huge privilege to be entrusted an absentee bid. Go back to me, and that I thought was for me really an honor and a hugely humbling experience.
Got it. So for your guys' knowledge, nobody wears a power tie better than this guy right here. So the man
I think
in
you
the red
invented
tie.
that, the man with the red tie.
The man in the red tie, so he was wearing a beautiful red tie that night. So you really didn't know that you'd be bidding on the most expensive watch in history that night?
No, I promise.
That's fascinating. And so the underbidder, I believe.
If you need these kind of shock moments, join the auction industry. You have plenty of them.
Yeah. The underbidder.
Like the $10 million bid from Tiffany. I didn't know. Just in case anybody was wondering, I did not know. Maybe you were asking that, were you?
So the opening bid, or the second bid for the Paul Newman was $10 million. Yes. And were you happy about that? Did that kind of throw off your rhythm?
Totally. And it wasn't staged or played. When you watch the video, you guys did a great video. So a Italian billionaire, and I really mean billionaire, you can look him up on the Forbes list, he's there with a big number of billions. Yeah. Via his agent comes to me 20 minutes before the auction, and he says, look, my budget is 5 million. I'm like, wow, 5 million. And I'd like to open the bidding with 5 million. Do you mind? Just to do a bit of... Yeah. And I said, don't you dare. Yeah. He said, why not? You're going to ruin the momentum. You know, it has to go 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. Don't you dare doing that. Oh, come on, let's have fun. And I said, you know, the auctioneer can refuse any bid. So don't you even try. I will just ignore you. Okay, I'll play by the book. So we start with a commission bid, $1 million, in the book, $1 million. And I hear Tiffany shouting, $1 million. 10. Like, you gotta be kidding me. And that, to me, was then like 10 minutes of silence. In those seconds that, if you look at the video, you can see there's like, what's going on? I look at the Italian guy in front of me, and I can just read his lips. Like, you don't let me do that, what about her? So I was like under pressure from an Italian billionaire looking at me like, what are you doing? So I had to play fair, but then I thought, wait a second, did I hear 10 million? 10 million, 10 million. I wasn't hoping or expecting anything near 10 million. Sure. I started doing the math, and I said, 10 million plus buyer's premium, that's more than the Steel 1518. I mean, I'm not going to refuse that bid just for the sake of giving 28 guys. You know, we had premium pedals. Right. A premium pedal was you had to really give additional bank references, etc. There were 28 guys registered for the watch on the phone and in the room. I'm like, 28 guys came for nothing because Tiffany is just bulldozering the room. Yeah. And I said, okay, I'll take it. And I was just like, please, is there anyone who gives me $10 million and $1? Yeah. Just for the, so at least it's an auction. Yeah. And then, of course, Natalie, 11. I mean, so nonchalant. Yeah. So happy end in the end.
That's amazing.
And Nell Newman crying, James Cox nervous in front of us. It was, I think I lost like 4 pounds during that auction. Yeah.
So in just a few minutes, we're going to open up the floor to questions. But before that, you know, we have such a rare opportunity here to speak to a master, certainly. I wanted to ask you about your own collection. So I've been lucky enough to see some of it, obviously amazing. What are some of your favorite pieces? You've seen everything. So where do you spend your own money?
I definitely have more watches than I need.
I think everybody in this room does.
I'm not sure. But you know, and that was again a very interesting point we had on our panel discussion at Philips on Tuesday night. The collector, the way people collected 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, like the stamp collector, the butterfly collector, it has moved on. And I really wonder, when is collecting becoming collecting? If you have 20 pairs of shoes, are you a shoe collector? No, you just like to change, you just like brown, black, short, light, sneaker, formal. And I think it's a little bit similar with my watches. I can get so excited about a $1,000 watch. I mean, the first thing I did yesterday, I came in and John Goldberg and I were going through the cabinets like, holidays are coming, maybe there's something I like.
Yeah.
So I can enjoy a time-only steel watch for a couple of thousand. And of course I get excited when I handle the watches at Philips in the millions. You cannot not fall in love with a pink 2499 or a Bao Dai amazing watch. I don't think there's really a line across my collection. If I have to think alphabetically, I have an Audemars, A, B, B is Breitling, I have a Breitling, I have a Breguet, C, a Cartier, I think I have a Cartier, D, I don't have a Daniel Roth, E would be Elgin, I don't have an Elgin. So I think you can go pretty much across the spectrum from casual to formal to two hands to quirky 70s. I'm now a little bit in a 70s mood.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm thinking steel and gold is something I should explore.
Note that. At the next Philips sale,
You
you'll
know
see
what?
a lot of steel
I
and gold.
think,
Yeah.
look, what is cool now, look at the car auctions. Now we're looking at F40s, GTOs, the 80s, the 90s, the 993 Turbo S's, the 964s. Today is hot what we, and I say we, 30, 40, 50 years old, had on our bedroom wall when we were kids. What did we have? The Countach. There was Cyndi Lauper. And what was cool back then? Steel and gold Daytona, steel and gold Nautilus, steel and gold Royal Oak, steel and gold even Datejust. So I'm in that phase now of, maybe I should have a steel and gold watch.
Yeah. And so you were raised in Zurich, correct?
Yes.
And so IWC has a big kind of place in your heart. I remember which was the one that really got you hooked on watches, the Aqua Timer?
When I was about 12, and my dad is in fact whom I owe this passion, and eventually that turned into a career. And as good Swiss Germans, of course there is an affinity to IWC. Schaffhausen is just an hour drive, not even. Sure. When I was 12, my dad says, "Son, it's now the moment that you have a proper watch." Oh. And to me, a proper watch was a Casio with a calculator. I thought I was so cool with I don't know if it's Casio or one of these computers, Japanese computers. And I don't know, I don't mean that. I mean a mechanical watch. And it was really a battle between him and his arguments. You know, the Casio in 6 months, the electronics will be more advanced and better, and yours will be old and falling apart. And it's, you know, the whole case is just one plastic block, so you cannot send it back for repair. He tried everything. He failed. I had to have my $150. Can you imagine how much money that was? Expensive. And after 6 months, the watch was broken, and nobody could fix it. So I learned my first lesson, and then my second and first real watch was an IWC that we bought at Chronometry Bayer on Bahnhofstrasse.
Mm-hmm. And you continued to collect Aqua Timers?
Well, IWC was a very easy access. Of course, also Zurich and Swiss-German part of Switzerland is very, IWC has a strong role and presence in that horological culture there. So going as a teenager, we're now thinking back to 1983, 4, 5. I went to flea markets, pawnbrokers, and 1 in 3 watches you would find for $50, $80 was an IWC. So this is how I learned business, discovered this world. Then, of course, watchmakers. Then my first trip to Schaffhausen, where I was able to find dials, hands. Oh gosh, Frankenwatch. I hear it already. Yeah, this is how it started.
Great. So at this time, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions for Aurel. Does anybody have anything to? Oh, yes, in the back there. We have a mic coming right over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for making our industry as great as it is today. But the one question I've always gotten from folks who aren't into watches is what is it you like more? Is it more about the aesthetics? I'm talking about vintage now. Is it more about the aesthetics, or is it more about the mechanical? Is it more about the sort of the difficulty of making something that small? And almost universally, at least for me, I hear the aesthetics, which always surprised me. I'd love to hear about what you hear.
Rationally, I often break the watch down into components. Maybe I shouldn't do that, but the way we catalog a watch, the way we look for signatures, it's always case dial movement or movement case dial. There's no order of priority. The three parts that are assigned, the three parts that are numbered, and that are sort of different entities. The dial and the case are the first and most obvious appearance. The movement only when you open it, because the vintage watches didn't have glazed case backs as they do today. The movement, however, is not just a fascinating mechanical piece of the watch, it's also often extraordinarily aesthetic in the way there's the Côte de Genève, the finishing, the jewels, the different colors, the three-dimensional constructions. It's unbelievable how some movements are works of art. Of course, you can't see them as often as a dial. I must admit that to me personally, and I hope I'm not getting hanged for that, aesthetics play a hugely important role. I cannot find a personal relationship with a watch if I just think it's ugly. Even though people tell me, you know, the guy who made it is the most genius watchmaker in the world. It is difficult, I admit. It's maybe very human. Maybe I should overcome this human aspect of mine, but a watch that is just plain ugly, I'm struggling to appreciate the quality. Sorry. Dials are, I think, like the oil on canvas within the frame. I mean, it's such an important part of the watch. Two-tone dials, applied numerals, raised scales. There are dials I could look at for half an hour without ever taking off the loop and my eyes from the watch. The case finish, the case proportions, a hallmark are, again, can be so sensual, can be so captivating, and then they have to go all together. Because, you know, having a great steak and a great sauce, but the sauce is actually a chocolate sauce, they don't go together. And therefore, there has to be a harmony, and I think it was, again, Matt who said that, or was it Alex?
I think it was Alex, yeah.
There has to be a ensemble. It has to work together. So I guess aesthetics play a little bit more than 50% of a role in my personal appreciation for a watch.
Great. Another question? Yep.
Hi there. First of all, congratulations on 10 years of Hodinkee and all your success.
Thank you so much.
And my question for Aurel, well, how do you feel, or what do you feel about brands and companies bidding for their own watches and to add to their collection? Would you consider that, you know, really enhancing the value of the watch? I think not too long ago, an Elvis Presley Omega sold for some sort of record, and later on I found out Omega, I believe, bought it back. So is that a genuine bid in your opinion?
I'm really glad you're asking this question. And I think before we started this, you said, can we bring up that topic? And I thought, yeah, sure. There's no secret about it. And I even prepared myself hoping the question would come. So let me give you the following numbers. Slightly rounded, but grosso modo they're correct. In nearly 25 years doing auctions myself, I added up roughly $1.5 billion in watches that I sold myself with my own gavel. Adding up all the purchases by manufacturers, that means, of course, Patek Philippe. There's no company that has bought more vintage historic pieces for their museum than Patek Philippe. Breguet, Audemars Piguet, Vacheron Constantin, Omega, and I'm sure I forgot some great names, Lang & Söhne, Cartier, etc. I think the total they bought from me, and well, who am I? I'm sure Osvaldo Patrizzi sold a lot and Darren Schnipper sold a lot. But from my $1.5 billion since the mid-90s, I think we're somewhere between $60 and $80 million in sales to 10 or 15 museums. That's 5% max. My first rhetoric question is, do you really think you can manipulate a market with 5% buying? Volume probably of those 5% is less than 1%, meaning it's like a couple of dozen, maybe 100 or 200 watches in total, out of tens and tens of thousands. I am obviously very, very delighted when manufacturers don't think of moral shareholders' value, but also honor the past, their heritage. I was really pleased to hear how Reynolds took yesterday from Omega very serious the restoration of their vintage pieces. It's part of it. Mercedes-Benz has a museum, Porsche has a museum. One day there will be an Apple museum, I'm sure. It's very important that the manufacturers do preserve the most important artifacts of their history. It's wonderful they make it public because there's many great collectors in this room, but I don't think you open your homes for me to see your collections or just anyone to go and learn. So they have an educational role. They preserve it. And by preserving, I mean humidity controlled, their security. So it's extremely important the service they do in the community. Now, if they win a watch for $1 million, yes, it goes into the press, and I'm sure it doesn't harm the company. I don't think they can manipulate or even steer a market up or down. By the way, on the Henry Graves super complication, as far as I know, Patek Philippe did not raise the pedal.
Right.
So those $24 million happened without them. So I think it's, again, a bit of an urban legend that I see on blogs. Whenever there's a Patek Philippe or Rolex making a strong price, it's either a Mexican drug dealer or a company manipulating the price. And I can assure you, none of the two is correct. It's part of our industry, and if you would like to buy the Elvis Presley at 1.6 million, you could have come to the auction, buy it, and then put it in your home. I'm happy as long as it goes to anyone who appreciates it, who is worthy the watch, and who preserves the watch for generations to come. There's no better or worse in that aspect.
Yeah, and I think something else to remember also with auctions is that if there's a winning bid, there's also an underbidder. And so you don't get to that $1.6 million without a $1.5 million bid, which means there was somebody right below Omega that was willing to pay whatever it was, 1.5. And then also, you know, if you are Omega, we had the CEO here yesterday. I mean, why would you not want to own Elvis Presley's Omega? You know, there's these great stories and great connections. You know, Paul Newman's Paul Newman and the Omegas that went into space, et cetera. These are the things that make these companies great. And so from my perspective, it makes sense that these brands would want to rebuy these items. Any other questions? Yep, right here.
So my husband is the watch lover, and he wanted me to ask this question because he had an emergency meeting and he couldn't make it. Twofold question. One, if I gave you $5,000, what watch would you buy if you found yourself in Switzerland? And then secondly, what do you think about female watches and collecting? I mean, all the watches that you have talked about and most of the watches that I read about are masculine watches. So I see myself now beginning to collect and moving towards like unisex watches. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I don't know where your husband is. He's in Florida. Wow, excellent. I was green of jealousy yesterday when Reynold Eschliman said, you know, 50% of our clients are women. I'm like, gosh, are you a lucky guy? With me, it's about 2%. And in fact, if I look at the room, I think there's 150 men and about 6 women. And I so much regret it. So ladies out there on the planet watching, please start collecting watches. I tell you, it would be so much more fun and more interesting. So thanks for being with us. The second thing, the $5,000 question. I would buy myself a simple, clean, time only, steel 50s, 60s watch. I can think of a great Seamaster Constellation. I can think of a fantastic caliber 89 IWC. There are Breitlings, there are Jaeger LeCoultres. You can buy a lovely Piaget with the 9P caliber. If you're lucky, just at $4,999, you get a nice Vacheron Constantine. If you're really lucky, an Ellipse by Patek Philippe. For sure, any given day, and I saw a couple fantastic reference 1601s steel Datejusts with a great American Jubilee bracelet, either a plain steel bezel or a white gold bezel. I mean, you could give me $50,000, I would come home with 20 watches. So I think that that's really cool about the vintage market. There's so much out there that we can still discover and enjoy. And I do apologize to any brand or any model I haven't mentioned. There are too many to choose from. You mentioned the medium size. Yesterday we spoke about the boy size. I don't think I own a single 42, 45 millimeter watch. I am sorry for myself because my wrist simply is so small that I cannot deal with what Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone can get away with. They seem to be built differently. So I'm Mr. 35 to 38 millimeters. This is considered big boys, I guess. To me, this is the most comfortable size, and I think 95% of all my watches are in that bracket. But I accept that today this is more or less boy size. I think even a 1518 with 35 millimeters is today considered, So.
Great. Yes, question in the back.
Personally, for you, what do you feel is the most aesthetically underappreciated watch?
Wow. Very good and very challenging questions. The aesthetically most underappreciated watch. I see I still have a minute 10. Or is that the time over?
That's over.
Oh, that's
okay.
over. Oh.
We can keep going, though.
Okay. As you probably found out by now, I love speaking a lot and taking 2 steps back before actually getting to the point. But it's always good to sort of lay the ground so that there's a joint understanding of where I'm coming from. Think of whether it's cars, architecture, art. I understand Vincent van Gogh himself didn't sell a single painting during his own life. Poor guy. Today, headlines at auctions, museums, etc. So we already have to acknowledge that there are fantastic masterpieces that we today don't recognize as such, because either they don't meet today's trend and sort of mainstream looks, and 10 or 20 years from now, we're like, wow, we didn't recognize the genius in that design. We today celebrate the Nautilus, the Royal Oak, Gerald Genta, and say this is the greatest ever. Of course, Cartier Tank and the Speedmaster and this and that, fine. What do we not appreciate today? Well, let's make a list of what is probably the least the most unpopular watches today. Who can help me make the list of the 5 ugliest ducklings? No, help me. First of all, I think it's the 70s and 80s that at the moment we're struggling with. Sort of asymmetrical, oval cushion. We also struggle with small 1920s and 30s watches. I think rectangular is struggling today. 2442 Patek Philippe, it's called the Marilyn Monroe. Sorry for the gesture. I shouldn't have done that. Me too. We go through waves and are influenced, whether it's by fashion, by architecture, car design. Do you know the Gerald Genta watches that he made after he designed the great watches for the others? And there's this rather cynical joke. He made the 5 greatest watches for the others, but when he did his own watches, he failed. These octagonal, pyramid-shaped watches. I tell you, 5 or 10 years from now, we will say, gosh, that was genius. Today we don't. We will in 5 to 10 years. I think another thing we will appreciate in a few years from now are the watches that are 33, 34, 35 millimeters, ultra thin Piagets, for example, Audemars Piguets, Vacheron Constantines, 2 hands, a coin-shaped, coin-sized round thing without any adornments, any embellishments, a plain time-only watch that today we think is boring. The most simplistic thing is the Movado museum watch. At the moment, we're looking for kind of loaded things, lots of hands, lots of bezels, lots of pushers. Rectangular, I think we will see a revival. It was already very, very hot 10, 15 years ago. Now we're at a soft moment. It will come back, sort of the Humphrey Bogart style, the Rolex Prince. So we'll go through ups and downs, and there's always opportunities for everyone to discover the next genius.
So we are a little bit over time, but we're going to keep going for 2 more questions. Yes, right here.
Hi, and congratulations for 10 years.
Thank you.
My question is, for a vintage watch, the accuracy, it's important, or by the time the watch become vintage, the accuracy, it's not important anymore?
Thank you for that question. To me personally, and I will shock you with my answer, I couldn't care less. First of all, what does it help to have a watch that shows to the second exactly the right time when the Uber is coming 10 minutes late? Then I'm arriving at JFK 45 minutes late. Then they tell me the airplane, due to late incoming aircraft, the flight is 2 hours late, and I have a chronometer that is on the second exact. Anyway, our mobile phones are there to really know what time it is. I even go a step further, but that's my wife, who also happens to love vintage watches. Recently, she takes a vintage watch out of the box, puts it on her wrist, and we go to work. And I look at the watch, and it shows 2 p.m. in the morning. I'm like, your watch doesn't run. She says, yeah, I didn't wind it. I said, yeah, but if you don't wind it, it will not run. She's like, who cares? It's beautiful. So, but that's her, and I don't know if she's now watching back in Switzerland. So, now, of course, now let's get serious. I like a watch to run, I like it to be precise, but if it doesn't, there's worse in life.
Great, and one more question. Yes, right here. Okay.
Thank you so much. My question is, you're saying that the supply of vintage watches is going down. I'm very curious on how you researched up until now your supply of the watches that you put on auction, and now maybe this will change in the next years, how you envision looking for those lots changing, I mean, 10, 15 years.
Can you, or can you just rephrase it?
Sure.
Yes. So I'm curious of how you have been looking for the watches that you've been putting on auction, and since you're saying that the supply is going down, what will you have to do differently to look for those watches to offer?
Really good question. Thank you for asking it. Throw vintage watches out and they're just burned or destroyed. It's most great vintage watches end up in collections of 30, 40-year-old, very active, young collectors like here in the room, and they have no intention to let go for the next 10 or 20 years. They're still young, they're still investing in their hobby, and therefore more and more things just disappear in drawers, on wrists with collectors, and are not coming back. How do we look for watches? There was a time back in the 80s that you could look for watches by going to Argentina, place an ad in the main newspaper and say, I'm here in town for 48 hours and I pay cash for your vintage Patek, for your vintage Rolex, etc., etc. And back then, I haven't done it myself, I was not yet in the industry, but I know from many, many dealers, you would end up with such a campaign with a pink on pink 1518, with a single button, with a Rolex 8171, and just numerous Daytonas for, like Matt Bain said, $250. These times are over. There's, I think really we've unearthed probably 80 or 90% of the great, great, great watches. We've unearthed them, we've brought them to the market, and they're now in circulation within the community. Therefore, we are hardly anymore investing in these campaigns, because why looking for a pink on pink 1518 when pretty much, I think most have been unearthed. Luckily, most of the great watches, and including the Paul Newman, we didn't find them, they found us. I must say it's obviously great if you have the press, online, offline, print media, TV report on how popular watch auctions are, how dynamic, how lively this market is. And this is why we get every week 20 to 50 inquiries from all over the world saying, hey Phillips, I have a Patek Philippe from my grandpa. Is it worth anything? Sometimes it's a Ellipse quartz for $4,999. Sometimes it's something very, very serious. Now, what's also interesting is the market has been auto-regulated. By definition, a market is auto-regulated because there's supply and demand. And if there's a shortage of something, the price goes up. The more the price goes up, the more eventually someone who has that good is saying, you know what, I paid 50 for it, now I can buy a house in the mountains for the holidays for 500,000 for it. You know what, it's just irresponsible to even own such a watch. I should let go. So supply and demand always go hand in hand. What's also fantastic is that whereas 30 years ago, you had 5 blue chip names in the catalogs, never ever would have an auctioneer thought in the 1980s to have Hoyers, Universals, Zenith, Breitling. So because the market is growing, also new things are coming to the market. Things that those guys who went to Argentina in the 80s would have just, no, I'm not buying Navitimer, keep it. So the market is in constant evolution and pretty healthily auto-regulating itself. And therefore, yes, it is difficult to find nice watches, but there's always something coming around the corner that the market appreciates.
Great. So speaking of that, you've sold the Paul Newman, you've handled the Graves. What is the watch that you would love to get your hands on in the future? Is there anything out there that remains your holy grail?
we're 12 minutes over, but first of all, and it's Saturday morning, so we have to wake up people a little bit. Now, when I sold the 1518 in steel at $11 million, and that was definitely a watch I wanted to sell, many friends and some here in the room came to me and said, Aurel, you can just go and pack your things and retire, because for the rest of your life, you will never ever sell a watch for that amount of money, so why not just calling it? And I told them, you know, it was never my mission or my priority or my goal in life to sell a watch for $11 million or to do world records. I love what I do, I love watches, I love to see happy buyers, happy sellers, and as long as I can pay all the bills at the end of the month, I'm really a happy guy. So what happens next? A year later, $17 million for the Paul Newman. I hear the same thing. Pack your things, you will never, you know what, that's okay. So just to make it very clear, this is not my daily adrenaline to get me up in the morning. There are watches that I'd love to find, that I'd like to unearth, that I'd like to offer maybe one day. Most of them are out of reach. I'm thinking of the so-called Marie Antoinette by Breguet, a watch of such historic dimension. It's probably sort of like the Leonardo da Vinci type of Mona Lisa moment in horology. Different than the Graves, different than the Paul Newman. Would love to watch, never handle it. I think it's impossible to handle it. It's now so safely protected, and it belongs to a museum. So I think you guys run a series, the 10 greatest watches that we're still looking for. Sure. Of course, I remember on that list some great Pateks and Rolexes formerly belonging to famous movie stars, singers. I think there's just that adventure, that getting so close to a movie star, that you can, by touching the watch, you can feel and even smell them, whether it's Paul Newman, John Lennon, Mick Jagger. I think there's still fantastic watches that would give me a huge sort of adrenaline boost.
Yeah, and we are now 15 minutes over, but one more question. You know, somebody that has long been associated with watch collecting that kind of predates Hodinkee in some ways is Eric Clapton. And you've sold Eric Clapton's 2499 Platinum. That was actually one of the first videos we did together, I think in 2011 or so. And he remains, I believe, a client. Is Eric Clapton still in the watch game?
Well, I hope you understand that I cannot reveal personal information about him. I try to be as diplomatic and relevant and say and I say the following: Eric Clapton loves watches today as much as 5 or 10 years ago.
Fair enough. Great. So I want to thank you, Aurel, for joining us here at Hodinkee. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thank you, guys.
We would like to thank Audemars Piguet, BMW, Cartier, Grand Seiko, Oris, and Zenith for their support in making this weekend possible.